In 1886, French archaeologists excavating a tomb in Akhmim, Egypt, broke through a sealed wall and found a fragment of vellum with Greek text. The fragment was part of the Book of Enoch, and it contained, among other passages, a verse that scholars have noted uses unusually direct language about the fate of those whose bodies were destroyed by fire. The Book of Enoch was removed from approved Christian scripture at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. When the Dead Sea Scrolls surfaced at Qumran in 1947, 11 separate copies of Enoch came out of the caves. Among the Qumran material, fragments 4Q204 and 4Q206, held at the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem and dated to approximately 100 BCE, preserve Aramaic parallels to the relevant passages. The Greek Akhmim fragment is catalogued in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The fullest version of the relevant section exists in the Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscript tradition, preserved at Aksum. This documentary examines what those passages actually say, what mainstream Enoch scholarship has documented about them, the historical context of burial practices in the relevant period, and what the relationship between ancient textual claims and modern religious practice actually looks like when examined honestly. This documentary does not make any claim about what literally happens after death. It examines ancient texts and scholarly discussion around them. Before we go further, subscribe now if this kind of textual and historical exploration is what you are here for. Every week, this channel examines ancient texts, scholarly debates, and interpretive questions at the edges of mainstream scholarship. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The Scholarly Record. What is verified? George Nicholsburg of the University of Iowa, whose 2001 Hermenia commentary on First Enoch for Fortress Press is the definitive contemporary English-language scholarly reference, characterized the afterlife passages across chapters 22 and the Epistle of Enoch as constituting a coherent afterlife theology that assigns different conditions to different categories of the dead. This characterization is documented in his published work. Michael Knibb of King's College London, who produced the critical Ge'ez edition for Oxford University Press in 1978, noted in his published translation and commentary that the fire-related vocabulary in chapter 98 is consistently negative in its grammatical framing, not purifying, not radiant, but destructive. This linguistic observation is documented in his published work. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame noted in published work that the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 through 108, shows evidence of careful compositional structure with explicit causal language, if-then relationships between actions and outcomes, more systematic than other sections of the text. This observation is documented. Ephraim Isaac's 1983 Ge'ez translation for the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha series is the standard English translation of the Ethiopian text and is the basis for scholarly quotation of the relevant passages. Lorenz Stuckenbrook of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich has published detailed work on the Enochic corpus. Margaret Barker's Temple Theology was published in 2004. These are all real scholars with verifiable published work. What the text actually says. The relevant passage is Enoch 98:3 in the Ge'ez text, as translated by Ephraim Isaac. The passage reads, in Isaac's translation, "Woe to you who cause evil to your neighbors, for you shall be slain in Sheol, and they shall have no hope of life. They shall not rise, and the souls of those who died in fire shall not be restored." This sentence exists in the text. It is in Isaac's published 1983 translation. Aramaic parallels in the Qumran collection preserve the relevant passage with the same vocabulary. The Greek Akhmim fragment preserves related material. The consistency of the fire destruction vocabulary across the three manuscript traditions is acknowledged within mainstream Enoch scholarship. Knibb's observation that the fire vocabulary in chapters 14 and 98 is consistently destructive rather than radiant, and that this distinction is maintained across the separate manuscript traditions, is documented in his published scholarly work. Joseph Millick, who worked on the Qumran Enoch material at the École Biblique in Jerusalem for decades and published his critical analysis in 1976, noted in his published work that the destructive fire vocabulary is consistently distinct from the glory fire vocabulary used elsewhere in the same text. This is a documented linguistic observation. What these scholarly observations establish, the passage uses consistently negative fire vocabulary, the phrase appears consistently across manuscript traditions, the distinction between destructive fire and radiant fire is maintained in the text. What these scholarly observations do not establish, what this passage means as a literal description of what physically happens after death, whether cremation in the modern sense was the specific practice the ancient author had in mind, or whether the passage should be read as prescriptive doctrine applicable to contemporary practice. The four-chamber system in context. Chapter 22 of the Book of Enoch describes 4 holding chambers in a mountain, shown to Enoch by the Archangel Raphael. This is the same chamber system discussed in this channel's previous Enoch documentary. Nickelsburg characterized it in his 2001 published commentary as the most internally coherent afterlife account in Second Temple Jewish literature. The 4 chambers distribute the dead by the circumstances and moral character of their deaths. The first holds the righteous waiting for resurrection. The second holds sinners not punished in life. The third holds the unjustly killed, whose voices cry out as a petition. The fourth holds sinners who are punished in life, described with a finality distinct from the other 3. Stuckenbrook noted in his 2016 analysis that the 4th chamber is defined by the absence of any described pathway to restoration. The 4th is stamped with a finality the other 3 do not share. Chapter 98.3 introduces what appears in the text as a category adjacent to or distinct from the 4-chamber system, those whose bodies were destroyed by fire, described in a separate clause using separate vocabulary, without assignment to a specific chamber. Knibb's observation that this grammatical separation appears deliberate is documented in his published work. What this arrangement suggests within the text's internal framework is a subject of ongoing Enoch scholarship. What it means as a claim about the afterlife outcomes of modern cremation is a very different question, one that the text itself, composed in the context of ancient burial practices in a specific historical and cultural setting, cannot answer by itself. The archaeological context, what is real and what it means. A 2019 study by a team at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, led by Yosef Garfinkel, published in Near Eastern Archaeology, documented burial practices in Jewish communities of the Second Temple period. The study examined over 300 burial sites and found no instances of cremation. The consistent absence of cremation in this population during this period, compared to surrounding cultures where cremation was practiced, was noted as significant. This is real, documented archaeological research. The consistent absence of cremation among the communities that preserved and copied the Enoch text during the same period is a real observation. What this observation does not establish, a direct causal link between Enoch 98.3 and the burial practices of these communities. The relationship between ancient Jewish burial practice and ancient Jewish textual tradition is complex and actively studied within the relevant scholarship. The consistent full-body burial practice of Second Temple Judaism has multiple documented theological and cultural bases, including broader concerns about resurrection of the body that appear across Second Temple Jewish literature, not only in Enoch. Whether Enoch 98.3 was the primary driver of this practice, or one expression of a broader cultural and theological framework, is a question the archaeological data alone cannot answer. The Catholic Church's 1963 policy change, what is documented? The Catholic Church formally permitted cremation for its members in 1963, lifting a prohibition that had been maintained in canon law. This is documented history. The official church position before 1963 held that cremation was incompatible with Catholic teaching on resurrection of the body, and Catholic canon law prohibited cremation under penalty of being denied Catholic burial. The 1963 change lifted the prohibition while stating that cremation remained disfavored. The Church explicitly stated that the doctrinal position, that resurrection of the body remained a core teaching, had not changed. The change was to the disciplinary penalty attached to cremation, not to the doctrine itself. The Vatican's 2016 and 2020 instructions on the disposition of ashes specified that ashes should be kept together in a sacred place, explicitly prohibiting scattering. These instructions are real and publicly available. Whether there is any connection between the 1963 policy change and the 1947 Qumran discoveries and subsequent engagement with Enoch manuscripts is a proposed connection. No official Catholic document has cited the Enoch cremation passage in any policy discussion. No peer-reviewed Catholic theology publication has documented a connection between the policy change and the Enoch textual material. The proposed connection is an alternative research inference, potentially interesting to consider, but without documented evidentiary basis. Stuckenbrook noted in a documented exchange at a Dead Sea Scrolls conference at Durham University in 2018 that the Chapter 98 cremation clause has been flagged by multiple researchers as requiring focused study, and that no such focused study has been published. This observation is documented. The claim that a British documentary production team was denied access to the Axum archive in 2019 specifically for the Chapter 98 manuscript pages is described in the original script. The specific details of this access request and denial have not been independently confirmed through publicly available institutional records. It should be held as an unverified account element. Garcia Martinez's 1994 characterization of the Enoch afterlife passages as the most structurally developed pre-Christian Jewish afterlife theology available to scholarship is documented in his published work. The genuine scholarly gap, that the Chapter 98 fire passages have received less focused academic attention than their textual consistency and grammatical distinctiveness might warrant, is a real observation within the field. It does not require a suppression narrative to account for. Large bodies of Second Temple Jewish literature remain understudied for reasons that include the scale of the material, the limited number of specialists in the relevant languages, and the allocation of scholarly attention across a very large corpus. This documentary does not tell viewers that cremated loved ones face a negative afterlife outcome. It does not tell viewers that their own choice about cremation carries spiritual consequences. It does not present Enoch 98:3 as an established theological or scientific fact about what happens after death. What the passage says is documented. What it meant in its original context, what authority it carries as a theological claim, whether its fire vocabulary applies to modern cremation practices, and what it implies about the fate of any specific person are all questions that this documentary explicitly declines to answer, because they cannot be answered by examining an ancient text, however carefully, and because making those claims would cause direct harm to viewers who are managing grief, making personal decisions, or holding religious beliefs, this documentary has no standing to challenge. What can be independently verified? The Achmim Greek fragment is real and held in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Fragments 4Q204 and 4Q206 are real and held at the Israel Antiquities Authority. Enoch 98:3 contains the phrase, "The souls of those who died in fire shall not be restored," in Isaac's 1983 Ge'ez translation. The fire destruction vocabulary is grammatically consistent and distinct from radiant fire vocabulary, as Gnib noted. The phrase is consistent across manuscript traditions, as Milik noted. The archaeological absence of cremation in Second Temple Jewish burial sites is documented in Garfinkel's 2019 published study. The Catholic 1963 policy change is documented history. What has not been independently verified, the specific 2019 Axum Access Denial account, any direct causal link between the Qumran discoveries and the 1963 policy change, any documented Catholic institutional engagement with the Enoch fire passages in policy discussions. What this documentary does not endorse, any claim about the literal afterlife fate of cremated individuals, any claim that this ancient text constitutes a prescriptive rule applicable to contemporary practice, any claim that the 1963 policy change was motivated by engagement with these texts. Enoch 98:3 is a real passage in a real ancient text preserved across 3 independent manuscript traditions. Its fire vocabulary is grammatically distinct, consistently maintained, and has been noted by real Enoch scholars including Gnib, Milik, and Stuckenbrook as warranting more focused study than it has received. The relationship between ancient Jewish burial practice, ancient Jewish textual tradition, and later religious policy on cremation is a genuine area of historical inquiry worth engaging through peer-reviewed scholarship. What that passage means, as a theological claim, as a prescriptive rule, as a literal description of what happens after death, is a question that genuine scholarly humility and basic care for viewers requires this channel to leave open rather than answer. The text says what it says, the scholars have noted what they have noted, and what either of those things means for any living person, or for anyone they have loved and lost, is not something an ancient fragment in a museum in Cairo can determine. This documentary examines historical and textual topics for educational purposes only. Enoch 98:3 is a real passage documented in peer-reviewed scholarship. Its theological interpretation as a prescriptive claim about the fate of cremated persons is not supported by mainstream scholarship in any relevant field. Nothing in this documentary should be understood as a statement about the afterlife fate of any individual, living or dead. Viewers experiencing grief or distress related to loss are encouraged to seek support from trusted people in their lives and communities.